Good morning. Welcome to the Point Reyes podcast, also known as Skyjack podcast, Watching Humans podcast. Quite the show today. So much to talk about. And we have Rick Lamnon is back to give us some insights on the elk, and Julie Phillips, I believe, is joining. Hopefully she'll be able to join us later. Jack's making sure he looks as handsome as possible. So Jack is as usual more optimistic and excited about this as me. I did extra exercise this morning to mellow out. I'm really gonna try to behave. So Jack, tell us the good news. Go ahead and tell everybody what we're talking about today.
I'm in vapor lock. I'm just overwhelmed with information. I sprained my ankle, so I can't run, which is my sanity maintainer. So you're going to deal with the Jack from New York, who my friends forbid me to blow cocaine, because no, we don't want you around if you're doing cocaine, which is how I am now. So good morning, folks. How about that?
Okay.
Good morning, Skyler. I'm excited about the show, and I already want to start out by saying we're going to be talking about the Point Reyes National Seashore settlement in a almost 3-year-long lawsuit, which ties in with another 3-year-long lawsuit about the Tule elk in the park. The one that went through was with 3 organizations who, it's actually a follow-up, an earlier suit from 2016, as you know, Skyler, and a resolution in all this mess has finally been reached. And for me, it's a classic example of half empty, half full. And I'm fine with you playing bad cop, angry cop, half full cop, 2/3 empty cop, whatever you want to be, Skyler. I encourage you to be yourself. And I want to start by saying next Tuesday, we should pick up part 2 of this, because we're just going to get, great. So everyone know, I've been so busy just trying to gather information and process things, because I'm old.
There's a lot
to read a lot.
Look, I saw all the emails going out through the group, and I saw all the different articles that people would send out, and each article has a little bit of a variation on the story. And unfortunately, journalists regularly don't get their facts straight. The Point Reyes Light almost never does. Doesn't seem to care about that. Tess Elliott, real quality person in Point Reyes, spreading lies, abusing her position as a journalist. All right, I already went off the rails. All right, so look, here's the most sobering thing I can say about it. This is a repeat of what happened last time. Pay people that aren't supposed to be there to leave out of sympathy for their transition, and then them not actually leave. Give them a transition period, millions of dollars again, and maybe someday they'll leave. Maybe we'll pay them a third time, after the park's completely demolished. Okay.
Now we're having fun. So my other preamble to this is I watched Chance Catrano of the Resource Renewal Institute hold a informational Zoom webinar last night for, I guess, honestly, I'm taking in so much information, I forget where it comes from now, but I think it was an hour and a half. And I'm actually in many ways in awe of Chance. He's a good policy wonk guy. I wish I had half his skill set for memorizing things. There's some basics I still can't tell you after eating the rod, reading through the record of decision. It's just, it's written in bureaucraties, and you have to have an advanced degree in semiotics and psychology to get through this stuff. And then I go to Jim Coda, one of my go-to sources, and say, how many cows are in the park right now? Nobody knows. He can tell me how many are allowed. Exactly. I'll get you wound up. But it's crazy making, and it's complicated. And I do see it. I choose to see it as a huge bit of progress. And I want to come back to your point. It's more of the same. You're referring to, for people who are new to this, which I hope watch this podcast or a recording of it, that ranchers were paid millions of dollars, the equivalent of $350 million decades ago, and then, as I simply say, reneged on the deal and didn't leave. And there's more detail on that for sure, but that's an accurate enough overview. The difference now, that waiting period is not 25-ish years. It varies from lease to lease and all that. It's 15 months, a very short time. and we are on them like flies to manure. So they ain't going to get away with it. And I was just speaking to somebody, which is why I was late to this meeting here. And I said, the question I had, which I couldn't ask last night because too many questions were coming into Port Chance, overwhelmed with stuff, was what if a rancher who's signed on to this pulls out, doesn't want to do it? Any penalty? Can the whole thing just collapse? Great question, right?
Yeah.
And I got an answer from Eric Mulvar of the Western Watersheds Project. And I sure hope what he was disclosing to me wasn't a secret. I don't think it is. It's probably in the details. But it's if they back out of the deal, the new record of decision, which we're going to call a ROD here, folks, is rezoning the land into the scenic landscape, so they can come back or not go, but they won't be able to graze cattle on it, except the little bit of grazing we're talking about. They can't run their farm as they did, their ranch as they did, because it's been rezoned. It's no longer the pastoral zone, which was their BS term for the graze cattle on the land and ruin it zone. It will change.
But they referred to the pastoral zone as the scenic zone. I mean, it was used as one as the same.
The rules have changed. It's the same land, and they're giving it a new name, which does designate now the priority is for tule elk. It used to be, they could run the elk off, haze them off the land, and there are, in my understanding, this is where it gets subtle, but the elk now have much higher priority. And it's not 100%, so you can go with that. There's still cattle out there. But the big deal is, and here it is, 8 minutes into the show, thousands of cattle and all the dairies have been removed from the seashore, Skyler. So I'll come at you
someday. Well, stop saying this like it's happened, Jack.
Well, you're so cynical, my friend, that in other words, like, the divorce proceedings are happening. She hasn't moved out of the house. Until she does, it's not over. It's like, well, technically that's true.
You're also acting like a divorced husband can't still come over and beat his wife.
I wish you wouldn't bring up the analogy of a husband and wife. This is really a bad choice. I wish. Oh, wait, I did that.
Oh, you did that, I believe.
Yeah,
okay.
I believe you're right.
Let me use the example of your trying to read the record of decision filled with verbiage that can be interpreted in different ways. That was also part of the first problem, because once they spent their money getting lobbyists, etc., then they said, oh, this is what this actually means. And right before we bring on, I see Julie and Rick are in the back waiting. We have two very special guests. Right before that, I want to play a clip from Elkwater featuring Ken Brower and referencing an administrative history of Point Reyes.
Go for it.
Showing that this is the exact same crap, because I saw the photos from the town hall meeting, Huffman's town hall meeting, and you described it to me, whining and complaining, millionaires.
Venting. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I don't have to play that yet. Should I go ahead and play it right now?
You know what you're showing, so my filmmaker friend, you decide when you want to show it. And
I don't want our special guests to wait too long, but
well, I want them to hear us. We're giving a general intro of what happened, and then they're going to come on, and they're two elk experts. We have Julie Phillips and Rick Landman coming, folks. It's the teaser, so people don't leave because we're so boring and weird. But I do want to give this overview, and then they're going to get into their specific. I'm guessing they're both going to have a relatively optimistic take as far as the elk go. The Tule elk now, the three herds are united. They can get at each other, and there isn't going to be the number of ranchers and cows and bureaucraties saying keep them separate. There's no more management of elk, including lethal management, for their population. That whole thing we were going crazy about, which is arbitrary numbers of carrying capacity, it's gone. It's gone now. So I'll let those guys get into more of the details of that. But there is some really good news for the elk. There's some good news with fewer cow numbers. And there's a whole bunch of cow pies of stuff we didn't get. We wanted all cows out. We didn't get that. We wanted to end all grazing in the park. We didn't get that. We wanted it to happen.
Which I'm hoping Julie and Rick will have some interesting things to say about, because I've been big into over on my ecology channel, passive restoration, where humans just get out of the way and nature actually fixes itself. Well, as long as you're bringing in the cattle, we're never going to have a chance to see nature fix itself. It's actually going to be perpetuating a problem under the veil of doing something good. let's
So
say good morning to some of our viewers. I appreciate you guys being here already. We've got Nick Cedar and Sledge, who are regulars. Good morning to both of you. And Jeremy has a last name that I can't pronounce. You want to do it, Jack?
I'm sorry, I don't see the chat here. I don't have that information. I just want to say one word before you go to other people about what is now going to be permitted. They're removing a lot of the cattle, and this is the part where I agree with you. It's really maddening. It's a huge compromise. There will be something called conservation grazing, bringing in cattle, either removing the cattle, but then they can bring in, it's like an average of 600 cows up to 1,200 cows, which is absurd, depending on how much grazing needs to be done. And I'm living on air quotes right now because it's such absolute nonsense. It's another, like regenerative ranching, it is a clean coal term of the cattle industry. You don't fix the problem caused by cattle grazing, which is land compaction, land desiccation, manure contamination of waterways and land by cattle, and bringing in invasive grasses to feed them by bringing in more cattle. And that's what conservation grazing claims to do, is to keep the fire danger down.
It's basically the exact same BS being used to cause there to be goats all over whatever part of California that there aren't cattle. And I've been deep into this topic for 6 years. The problem is only getting worse where they're grazing. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You are saying that you need the cattle to fight a problem that the cattle ensure remains there.
Absolutely, Skyler, 100%. We are really aligned on that one. And I think you called it a circle of death.
I call it a lot of things. I call it a lot.
A circle of death, where you kill the land by animals and then fix it by bringing in those same animals that killed it, creating a circle of death.
I got to ask, are the ranchers that are paid millions of dollars to leave with their cattle the same people that are going to be paid to bring their cattle in to graze it?
Well, it's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to it. I don't know if anybody knows the answer to it.
They found another way to make even more money. They got a buyout, and we're going to pay them to graze now.
maybe we'll bring Eric Mulvar. He's a good guy. I'm getting to know him a little bit, talking to him about the settlement.
That'd be great.
From Western Watersheds Project next Tuesday. I know that's kind of soon. It depends on how busy he is. But he was the one who's explaining. I mean, he's been in the game a long time as an activist and as a wildlife biologist, like Laura Cunningham, same wonderful cut of jib. And he was saying, well, bureaucrats typically write this language to give them, they want to have the most leeway, the most flexibility. So they write it intentionally vague, which is true and damning, and also the nature of bureaucracies. Oh my God, that's a Dutch name, Nieuwenhuis, I would guess. Nieuwenhuis.
He pronounced it.
I do pretty well with that as a Gescheit. I live in a grass house. I make an effort to pronounce difficult names. Nieuw is definitely Dutch. Nieuwenhuis is how I would guess. Might be another syllable in there.
Well, he's phonetically spelled it out for us. Look.
Oh, I didn't see that. Okay, I'm now seeing the chat. Anyway, yeah, I'll take it away, Skyler.
Okay.
Oh, and Paula, thank you, Paul. I've learned much from Jack's Tree Spirit emails, newsletters about what fire management does to the forest. Any human management. Oh, excuse me. I'll be careful. I'll reel it in. Most human management is destructive. Most of it is driven by profit motive, or even deeper than that, an ideology of controlling things. Skyler and I know agree on this generally. Control, control, control. As I call it, man age, hyphened, man age, the age of man, where we have to, nothing's wild anymore. We need to manage everything.
Yep. And yet we have our entire history showing us that every time we try to manage things, we make it worse. But we're, as the most intelligent species, we are incapable of learning from that history.
So I would argue we're the least intelligent species, the only one destroying the planet. But that's my common refrain. Perfect pronunciation. Thank you, Jeremy. Yes. That's because, well, I dated someone with a very similar name, but we won't get into that. So we are 9:15 still. We're doing okay. Where would you like to go, Skyler? Do you want to chew this over a little bit more? I'm just trying to decide whether when people watch this, they want a little general overview of what just went down, or whether people watching this will know about this deal with Resource Renewal Institute, Western Watersheds Project, Center for Biological Diversity. poor Skyler. This is so painful. These three environmental org litigants, God bless them, in this fight and for years. And I do want to say this. I watched the town hall, which is a separate discussion that Congressman Huffin arranged with 6 different speakers at a dais, Over 200 people showed up. I'm currently up to, I think, 6,500 word blog that nobody's going to read. It's a book. I'll put on my website before I leave town on Thursday morning. I've got to go away for a few days, but I'll be back. It was fascinating. Political theater, class. In this country, we don't talk about class theater. And then, of course, the politics of Point Reyes Seashore. It was very much a rancher-friendly community with grievances and anger. And I felt a little bit like I was kind of at a Trump rally. It wasn't that violent, but it was just huge amounts of passion and genuine emotion and people pouring their hearts out, but misinformed. Never in the room was it discussed that, well, these ranch families were paid millions, as you started out 20 minutes ago. The ranch families were paid, took the money, and didn't leave.
I was looking at the photos of that Trump rally at the Cow Palace or Dance Palace, whatever it's called. And I was just thinking, my God, these people are a perfect reflection of the person that they voted for. Someone who promotes a lie, is rich, didn't really earn anything, and continues to whine. I mean, Trump is the whiniest leader. Anyone, it's always, oh, woe is me, woe is me. That's not what you want in a leader. And yet these ranchers are supposed to be pillars of the community. And they lie unabashedly. They take advantage of the taxpayer. They hurt the planet. They make a shitload of money, and they're still complaining. And they're being paid again and still complaining. But I got it. On that note, I just want to
interrupt you for a second there. Before you go further, I 100% agree with everything you said. Please continue.
Well, I don't know if that was worth ruining my train of thought, because my brain doesn't work well enough to get away with that. Oh, yes. As you're going to see in the clip, what they're saying today and have been saying every year for the last 50 years is the same thing that they said when the government originally tried to purchase the seashore in its completeness, was that it would bring economic ruin to Marin. They've been saying that since the 50s. Now, if these ranchers cared that much about Marin's economy, they should obviously have refused this deal, because they're so worried about Marin's economy, right? Oh, no. Oh, more money for us, and we get to escape from a dying industry that was started dying back in the 50s, by the way. Some ranchers were already voluntarily leaving even before the government came in to purchase that land. Isn't it interesting, Jack? What would you like to put some money on whether or not Marin's economy collapses?
There was so much stuff. There was several people who, were very tearful, and it was so interesting, just sociologically, because there are people who are genuinely crying because they believe what they're saying, and talking about being, torn from their homes, and they have to leave the land, and because they've been there 3 generations. And in the room was two Native Americans who spoke, Teresa Harlan, Coast Miwok, and Dean Hoagland, this wonderful man, just such a good, we Jews would call him a mensch, just this wonderful warm vibe from the guy. He's grounded, and he speaks with authority without my kind of, Jack song and dance stuff. I just admire the man as a human being. And these 2 representatives represent a people with an unbroken lineage of thousands of years connection to the land and hundreds of generations, in the same room with people who have more power, more money, are once again getting money to leave by claiming they have a deep connection to the land. Right. And that's going on in the room. It's all right there. I wanted to stand up and make this comment, but I knew I would just get stoned. Like, there's no point. It's not going to penetrate, because the fog of disinformation and passionate misinformation is so strong, so heavy.
All right. I was going to go there. You talked about Evans saying that he wasn't given a choice or offered a deal, which may have been I had no choice. I had no choice, he said. Probably a lie. But again, as usual, the ranchers think that history started with them. I'm trying to think about the choice that the Miwok were given by the ancestors of the ranchers. What kind of a choice were they given? Slavery, conforming to Christianity, and working on ranches, or be slaughtered. I believe those were their choices.
Again, I'm sorry, am I interrupting, or did you pause? No, seriously. I can interrupt easily, as my ex would tell me, and I'm trying not to. I would say, for people who know me, say just put up your hand, and that'll stop Jack. He'll stop his car at the red light, and he'll actually let the other traffic pass. Yeah. So are you done? Sorry.
Yeah. How about if I play that clip and we bring in our guests?
Great.
I'm actually going to bring them in just because I'm nervous that they won't be able to hear the clip backstage.
Okay. And again, so we're 20 minutes in. This is the Skyjack podcast. We'll be doing this show again next Tuesday, which is the 21st of January. We'll do more on this topic in one way or another. Not sure who our guest will be. And I'm putting a blog up about this before I leave in 2 days on my treespiritproject.com website. Skyler is Watching Humans YouTube channel.
Rick and Julie, I'm going to bring you in, but I'm going to go straight to playing the video clip so you guys can see it, and then we'll all start talking. And I'm going to do a little screen share window.
We have multiple elk that have obvious signs of getting tangled in the fence. Can you imagine getting your antlers stuck in a fence, becoming helpless, and either slowly dying of starvation, dehydration, or actually having predators start to pick you apart because you can't defend yourself? I mean, this is the nightmare of our national seashore, and the justification for the continuation of these nightmarish conditions comes down to what? No, who is on the other side of the fence?
Well, ranching is not supposed to be part of the national park. It's against all kinds of policies that the Park Service has. The reason we have it is that the Park Service did not have the money to acquire all the land they wanted in this national park. So there was this period where we were going to have ranching as a stopgap measure, 25 years to the life of the rancher, in order to make this transition for all parties concerned and make it easier for the county, make it easier for the ranchers themselves, and allow time for these funds to be accumulated. The problem has been that once these ranchers were there, they knew a sweet deal when they saw it. They're subsidized by the taxpayer. And industry that was dying, the dairy industry on California's coast, had this resurrection at the expense of the taxpayer. Once these folks are in there, they have become quite a potent political force. They've got people in farm bureaus on their side. They've got people in government on their side now, and they're persuasive, and they don't want to go, they don't want to move. And we're at a verge of a situation where they'll be here forever, which was never the intent of this park.
For someone like you, whose history goes back to the creation of this seashore, how does this idea that ranching was always meant to be there sound to you?
Yes, I know that this wasn't true because I observed this process. As a kid, I watched my father and his colleagues at the Sierra Club and elsewhere fight for this park. I know what they wanted for it and what the law says it's supposed to be. I also, just to verify my own memories, I've read a very good administrative history of the national park by Paul Sadie. It was commissioned by the Park Service and makes all these points. That it was never, none of the people who proposed this park in the beginning ever mentioned ranches as being a part of the park at all, permanent or not. They avoided talking about ranching because ranching was a problem in establishing this national park. Connie Worth, who later became the director of the Park Service and who was the first man to propose a park, at Point Reyes in 1935, never mentioned ranches. He said the whole point of this park was recreation for people and the diversity of wildlife in this park. He never mentioned ranching. Clem Miller, who was the author of the legislation, never mentioned ranching as something that was desirable. In fact, it was something that he had to overcome. It was an inherent problem on this land that had to be finessed. And it was never considered something that you're supposed to have in a national park. I think almost everybody knows what the purposes of a national park are. and they're not to have taxpayers subsidize private ranching on public land.
And what about this notion that it is thanks to the ranchers that the seashore even exists?
The ranchers, from the very beginning, opposed the park. Before they'd even seen the particulars of the park plan, they were against this national park. They lobbied against it on both coasts. They sent a delegation to Washington to argue, and they sent a delegation to the Board of Supervisors in Marin County, who immediately, sight unseen, agreed to oppose the park. So the ranchers from the very beginning were opposed to the park. Their argument that they were partners is false. They were dragged, kicking and screaming, to the table on this park. They formed an organization against the park, the West Marin Property Owners Association. A rancher formed this group to try to stop the park. So the idea that this was some kind of a partnership with the ranches is incorrect.
My name is Judd Howell. I'm a wildlife ecologist.
All right, I stopped screen sharing. Everything running smooth? Julie and Rick, welcome to the show. Good morning to both of you.
Julie, a wildlife biologist specializing in Tule elk, and Rick Landman, a doctor and researcher of Tule elk. And I'm sorry I don't have your bio more accurately in front of me at the moment, Rick. I'm overwhelmed with too many things to think and say. But thank you guys for both showing up. I really appreciate whatever it is you're going to say, and you're making time to be on the show with us. And we're going to run long today, by the way. We're giving you guys more than another 30 minutes because this is such a hot topic right now.
Julie, what do you think about what I said earlier about the cattle coming back in, preventing actual natural restoration?
You're right on, Skyler. It's ridiculous. So we're in a moment in history when restoration ecology is being taught on nearly every college campus, university campus. It's being practiced in the field. So restoration ecology is using the native species to restore the land. And so in my many years of out tracking elk, in some of the places where the cattle were removed and the elk brought in, the land was naturally restored because the elk are discriminate feeders. They go and they feed and move and feed and move, where the cattle will just take it down through the roots. I mean, cattle will literally destroy native plants by not just taking the surface part of the plant, but below the roots. And so using this concept that they're going to do this, if there's native stuff restoring and growing back in those pastoral lands that are a mess, the cattle aren't going to help. The cattle will make it worse. And so I think you're right on that. We should follow what we actually teach and what we believe in the field of wildlife management and ecology. And this is a good example for people to be able to actually document, which I know you two definitely will, document the restoration of this native land. And cattle are not the way to do it.
Right at the end of my clip, Dr. Judd Howell was coming on, and he's also a wildlife ecologist, and he's worked for the Bureau of Land Management and the Park Service. And he told me in his interview, he talked about the great move that happened while he was working there, which was the Giacomini wetland restoration, which meant getting rid of the dairy and letting nature come back into a working ecosystem. The other thing he said was, you're not going to restore anything as long as cattle are there. Now, this is a guy who grew up on a dairy ranch. You know, he came from a dairy background and then became a wildlife ecologist. Like, to think that I hired somebody and paid them to lie about that seems pretty preposterous. But equally preposterous is that our National Park Service, our staff, would, with all of this evidence in front of us, as you just said, this is being taught, and we have evidence right there in Point Reyes of an example of restoration taking place when you remove the cattle. These are the people who are saying we need cattle. And this is why the whole staff have to go. I don't care just about the ranchers going. That staff is an extension of the ranching community. Okay, I will shut up. Rick?
So I think it is true. Our native grasslands, which are perennial grasses and bunch grasses are overrun by these Eurasian annual grasses that the Spanish brought in to feed the cattle, which have now taken over, and they die in the fall, whereas California used to be not brown in the fall, but greenish or grayish green from these perennial grasses. So the cattle will eat those Eurasian annuals, and sunlight can get to poppies and other native wildflowers. So with targeted grazing, often you see a resurgence of some of our native wildflowers, and people think that's great, but they're also not restoring the perennial bunch grasses. It was really Julie's work and education of me around Pacheco State Park, where the perennial bunch grasses have returned. There's some data that cattle are actually wrapping their tongue around these grasses and pull them up by the roots, and versus elk just sort of lightly grazing, nipping at the perennial bunch grasses and actually promoting these big, healthy root systems, which, by the way, sequester a lot of carbon. The spaces between the bunch grasses get filled naturally by our native wildflowers. So there is published data that the elk on Tomales Point restored the grasslands from chaparral. There is published data that they're removing non-native invasive grasses naturally for free, which is why I like to say they mow the grass for free. But it's a missing part of the ecosystem, and our grasses, our native grasses, are not adapted for cattle. They're adapted for elk and vice versa.
And also the coastal prairies. I mean, what you see at Point Reyes National Seashore. I mean, it's, you know, it was really crazy when I went out to check out, Stu and I went out to check out the fence last week just to see what the difference was. And you could tell along that fence line that had been taken down where the elk had traveled through the coastal prairie very gently and had kind of moved along the fence before it was removed. But there, you could barely tell. There were tracks and a few little bit spots, but I mean, it was totally intact for that many elk being in that area. And they would walk along the fence line, move in and around. And it was just incredible to see how they really don't destroy things, including the coastal prairie and the native grasslands. And we've seen this in sites that I've been in the past where the elk were brought in, the cattle removed. The Pacheco State Park's one, but there was other ones in Santa Clara County where I was at. And when the elk left because the cattle were brought back in, the elk just shifted out of there. They destroyed that habitat, a little valley that was just beautiful, within a month. I mean, a few weeks. They literally went in and destroyed it. I mean, took out the native grasses, the native shrubs, perennial grasses and so on. And they also took out the native trees, the oaks, which was pretty crazy. I mean, they took every little seedling and destroyed it. I mean, I went in there, I was shocked, and I said, I'm done. I'm not coming back to this ranch because it was so terrible what happened so quickly. So they're bringing cattle back to Point Reyes or never leaving is a concern for a national park.
Now, Rick says that prescribed grazing can work, but the reality of Point Reyes is that pastoral land, you won't find one native perennial grass. I mean, that place is just the most mismanaged, as Laura Cunningham said, the worst she's seen in all of her years working for the BLM. I just can't believe that continuing to bring cattle into a place that cattle have beaten to death is going to cause natives to return. Like maybe it's, and I'll just throw this out there because the places I'm seeing, there isn't any enough wildlife left for me to give the wildlife credit for the restoration I'm seeing. To me, it almost seems like even without wildlife interacting, just getting the cattle out of there and humans out of there and weed whacking and all that out of there still leads to a better situation over time. So I certainly can't say that you're wrong, but I personally have still never seen a example in person where cattle caused the native plant situation to become better.
We could show you, protected lands in Santa Clara County where there were no wildflowers, and now with targeted grazing, there are some, but this is cosmetic. They're not actually restoring the original biodiversity. And they're just getting rid of these Eurasian annuals that were shading out some of our wildflowers. In the absence of elk, I think you need targeted grazing to reduce fire fuel loads. in the presence of elk, you don't need the cattle, right? So the biggest reason to bring elk back is so that they'll reduce fire fuel loads, especially these days with what's going on in Southern California.
And if I may, Rick, it's probably our only point of divergence. I don't consider the way you prevent destructive wildfires is by home hardening and creating defensible space around houses. You don't manage. I mean, and again, here's the nuance of it, why it gets tricky. Some of what you say may have some validity. I'm not saying you're totally wrong. You could never, do cultural burns and historic, all that stuff to keep wildfire down. But these days, management goes so over the top, ballistic, driven by capitalism, profit, greed, and ignorance, that as soon as you open the door to say, well, we're going to have some management by grazing or by machine tools or by mowers, it opens the floodgates to what we're seeing now, which is actual deforestation and destruction of wild forests to manage fuel loads. Fuel loads is what managers call a forest or a grasslands now. I just don't trust them. And I also don't think it's necessary, to your point, to be specific, at Point Reyes, the elk are now freed. I want to talk about that with you guys. Let them go out and multiply. There's 700-ish now. We're about to get new numbers from the Park Service to do an annual count. I'm guessing, Julie, there's going to be at least 800 by the count. I've had a few friends go out there. I haven't been out in the park, saying there's a lot more elk out there. I think you've been out there. And I'm guessing the number is going to be 800 or so, which means by your numbers, it's 10 or 13% increase per year if they're not, beaten on and fenced in as they've been. And we're going to have 1,000 elk in a year or two, and then 1,200 elk. And this is great. And let them go over the 16,000 acres that's been at least diminished cattle grazing, a large diminishment, so the elk can take over the wild park, as they always should have been allowed to do.
Well, I think what's going to be pretty incredible to watch and for you guys to document is that fence going down, which is so incredible, what one side looks like versus the other. And that answers your question about letting these guys selectively graze the cattle. But those elk will literally pull those plants with them in a sense. They kind of carry the different portions of the plant and kind of plant it as it goes. So they will restore, the restoration will occur by the elk moving out of that prison that they've been in and taking it out into the open range. And watching that happen is going to take time. We're talking about years and years.
Yeah.
It's going to be incredible. And that's what the National Park Service has this opportunity to create this classroom to actually be able to document what's going to happen. And this can be used as a model across the state where tule elk are found, that the value of the tule elk in managing for fire and other kinds of things. So those elk will literally help spread that native landscape and restore it. And that's what's going to be, because it's just the difference, and you guys have seen this many times, between both sides of the fence isn't incredible. I mean, it was shocking to actually get to walk along there.
Oh,
I've
yeah.
never done that before.
So just to go over this again. So you're saying, Julie, that the natural behavior of the elk will help move the evergreen, I'll call them, the perennial plants in the reserve out onto more of the pastoral zone, the cattle damaged land. You're saying those plants will migrate by the elk doing that somehow?
The elk will assist in the movement of that, and we've seen it. In places where the cattle were removed and the elk were kept in there, it's been incredible what we've seen. That's why that valley that I mentioned, I was so upset, because the cattle were removed, the elk were allowed to roam freely through there. They restored it in fairly years that we'd been in there, but it was, and the cattle came in and immediately destroyed it within weeks, months. And you could see the elk literally, they'll carry it in their hoofs, they carry it in their mouth, they drop things to their feces. I mean, this is going to be an incredible, and again, the coastal prairie will be interesting to see how it restores itself. And then the other things, we'll see the native grasslands, that's going to take a while too, but it'll be something to see. But looking at the dynamics, you should get some photographs of just that spot. I think you have, Skyler, before, where the fence went down, just what one side looks like. I mean, how can anybody argue in the National Park Service against this? And why would you? I just don't agree with bringing cattle back in. I'm really sorry, because it's so degraded. There's not going to have to be any fire management. The elk will roam freely. I don't buy it.
And I've said this to Jack many times in personal conversation. One of my chief concerns when that fence was first coming down was that cattle would be able to go into the reserve and just like that undo all the restoration that had happened there. Like Tamales Point is an example in itself of how the habitat improves when you remove the cattle and let the elk roam out. They had to recalculate the carry capacity because the habitat improved so much over time with the removal of the cattle. And here we have people celebrating, oh, the elk are free, the elk are going to be in Point Reyes, and yet we're not going to let them restore Point Reyes. We're gonna bring in cattle. It's just mind-boggling to me that we're still not using our native animals to do what the native animals will do for us, as Rick said, for free and want to do. They don't have to be fenced in and force fed until we slaughter them. As their actual purpose on this planet, they will go in there and fix the situation.
Well, and that's what the mission of a national park should include, which it does include, the natural restoration of the land. So bringing in or keeping the cattle there doesn't make any sense if we really, truly believe in it. Now, it'll be good to monitor it and see what happens. But again, the elk, there's enough elk there, they'll do their job.
I want to underscore what Julie just said. And I think what your clip was getting at, that Point Reyes, when I heard that the cattle would be mostly removed, or theoretically, I said, wow, it's going to become the American Serengeti. Because it was the year after I graduated from college. It was 1978 when they dumped 10 to 12 Thule elk there. They actually increased in population 100% every 3.5 years until the drought of recent years, where they were, decimated in Tumulus Point because they didn't get any water. But this is the home range for an elk herd's only 500 acres at Point Reyes, because the land is so, it's moister, it's more mesic, it's great forage for elk. This population is going to soar, and they're going to do their ecological job. But then I realized the Serengeti is actually the wrong analogy, because Point Reyes is the only park in the world that has both hoofed megafauna and breeding marine megafauna, namely elephants and horses. And I actually increased my subscription to ChatGPT to see, is there any other park that has breeding elephant seals or any marine megafauna, as well as hoofed ungulates? This is the only park in the world with breeding gigantic ungulates and pinnipeds.
But I think we should be really cautious too, saying that population is going to soar, because I don't necessarily agree. A normal increase is about 14%, and that's what we've seen. And really, if the elk were truly soaring, their numbers should be over almost 2,500. And even statewide, it's crazy, but there should be so many more elk. And so what happens behind the scene at Point Reyes is going to be critical at this point to continue monitoring, because who knows what's going on, because again, their numbers.
You're hinting at poaching.
But yeah, I mean, it's called the three S's: shoot, shovel, and shut up. And who knows what's been happening at Point Reyes for a very long time. So I don't think it's going to soar. I think it's going to be a gradual movement, but getting to watch the elk kind of slowly roam over those areas, and just how they it's just going to be neat to watch where they go. I'm really curious about which areas will they go to. How will they interact themselves? I mean, it was amazing how you guys showed how some of the elk, and Matthew, I think, it showed how some of the elk moved so quickly out of the fence. I was kind of shocked, because normally when humans have been along those fence lines, the elk are a little more nervous.
Yeah.
So they moved fairly quickly. So you knew they needed to be out of there. So
think about the noise and the disturbance of taking down that fence, and yet the elk were still sitting ready to make their move.
The fence came down on December 3rd and 4th. The full day on the 3rd, half a day on the 4th, a Tuesday and a Wednesday. I was there Wednesday afternoon after work. It stopped on that day and a half of work. And in that hour or 2 hours I was there, I saw 3 bull elk walk into new territory. That's how quickly they did. It wasn't like weeks for them to figure it out. And then seeing that and talking to you, Julie, and a little bit to you, Rick, as well, I realized the elk are just such sensitive, aware, connected to the land and the environment, and by sensation, by instinct, by smell. They are going to, I'm confident now that the bachelor herd, as we folks call it, up in the northernmost part, miles north of the fence line, are going to get the wind through what I like to call Thule elk telephone. They're going to get wind that things have changed, and they can drift south to the plateau. The plateau herd can drift. There's 4 subherds in the park for people who are listening to this, as we all know here. Drift to the southern herd, and the southern herd obviously already knows the fence is open. So it's just a new game in town. And I want to answer 2 questions in the chat. Mr. Neuenhuis asked, once we get cattle off the land, are we, meaning the public, going to be allowed to access the land for sitting quietly and just being still? And the answer is a resounding yes. There are far fewer ranches. It's now they're calling it by a new name for whatever that's worth. It indicates some change of scenic landscape. They do want to put in more trails. They want to have more public access. The land, I asked somebody else, will the barbed wire fences come down? Oh, I asked this of Eric Mulvar of Western Watersheds Project. Once a ranch is retired, because 6 dairies are leaving Point Reyes Seashore, and let's see, a total of 12 of 14 ranches. So 6 more beef ranches are leaving as well. And Derek was asking, you know, what's going to be left? Which specific ranches are not leaving? It's the D. Rogers Ranch, owned by Dave Evans, is not leaving. And Chance Catrano showed a map last night in his RRI presentation of these 3 separate little parcels, which are all his. And I still have questions about that and what's their connectivity. But the tide, in my opinion, the optimist, I guess, choosing to be, the tide has turned. Fewer ranchers, more public to go out and enjoy those areas that were once, you got the impression you weren't supposed to go out there, even though it's public land. And we'll be able to keep more of an eye on things and enforce more of these rules and regulations.
Well,
So Evans, the guy who isn't leaving, is the guy who was complaining?
Yes, he was saying, I actually recorded him. I just not quite ready to share that because I this is strange to say, but I don't want to wail on the guy. He was genuinely upset, and he is staying, but he's, as he was saying, he's going to be alone out there, which he will. And of course, you know, we're not going to stop doing the right thing, which is to monitor pollution and destruction by cattle, reporting it to the media and the public. And I just assume at some point, and he's allowed to, he can say, you know, I want to retire too. I want to get out of here. And he will be accommodated. That will happen. It's not going to be a great place for him to remain in at this point.
It was a great question by Jeremy, because I actually have a concern. If you're still bringing in cattle, especially in the numbers that you're talking about, well, are you going to go sit out there with cattle? Are they going to allow you to go sit out there with cattle? Are they going to say that you're harassing the cattle? And what about the fencing? As long as the fencing,
I can answer your questions. I can answer those questions.
What about the fencing? Well, you cut me off because that fencing staying up.
You had 3 questions. I'll answer them all. I also let you ask 10, but then we got to remember what you asked. Okay. So will people be allowed out there? Yes.
They already were, though. That's the funny thing.
The difference is the tide has turned, which is to say there aren't as many human being ranchers out there with their ranch employees chasing you off with their ATVs. They're not going to be there. And
no more pillars of the community to illegally chase you off the land that you own.
Do you want me to answer one of your questions and move on to the second, or you just want to debate everything because, you know, I don't know the answers either?
That's not a debate. I'm just adding a little color.
Well, certainly.
But I'm already impressed that you can get in your car and slowly drive across Point Reyes and see elk 10 yards, 20 yards from your car. Our elk herds in eastern Santa Clara County, as soon as they see you, they take off. They're gone to the next ridge 5 miles away. And I think it has to do with what Julie's talking about, poaching and harassment versus, you know, being in an area that's patrolled where the elk feel safe.
So let me add one more comment to yours, and then I want to get Julie's reaction to this because it's a question I've had. I actually, as I've gone out there now for the last few years since seeing Skyler's film, The Shame of Point Reyes, and spending much more time with the elk, hours and hours with the elk, although not as much as Skyler, not as much as Derek, and probably not as much as you two. I'm just aware of how sensitive they are. And the fact that we can get so close to them, as Rick is saying, which is a selling point for tourists who come by the millions to see these magnificent elk up close, like you can't do anywhere else from your car. I actually begin to be like, I want to give them more space. I want to give them more privacy. I don't want more tourists running out there and chasing after the elk to take pictures with them like they do in the national parks with bears in Yosemite and stuff. I mean, that's like, I'm always on the side of the animals, as many people here listening are. And I worry there's not enough space out there. I'm so glad they're getting another 16,000 acres of cattle grazing. And to your point, Skyler, the cows will be brought out there seasonally. There's not an absolute number. It can be up to 1,200. That's the absolute max of that can be allowed. The guesswork I've heard, the average will be 600, and that's already thousands fewer than we're out there. They're not belonging to the specific rancher who's standing there saying, get those people, chase those visitors off my land. The dynamic has changed. There are more of us now, more elk, more visitors, fewer cows. Of course, I'll get you a full rebuttal, but I'm just saying we have to still monitor it. we activists are going to continue exactly what we're doing, which is fighting for what's right out there and letting the public know, and we'll win. The ranchers can't win. The tide is turned against them now. They know, and of course, we'll keep doing water monitoring so they know that they can't get away with pollution the way they used to. And is there still bureaucracies and BS and lax enforcement and no penalties? Yeah, but that's what we do. That's our job.
If cattle are brought in at a specific time to specific locations, that means fencing. Are they going to leave the fencing that's already there? Are they going to set up fencing every time it happens? That's habitat fragmentation for these free roaming elk.
Well, the elk can get over the fence. I mean, I agree with you. That sucks, and it shouldn't be. I totally agree. Every time I try to bring a ray of sunshine, you're like, but it's still dark. I'm like, yeah, it's dark. You're right, Skyler. It sucks. But the fencing they put up is not going to be impenetrable 8-foot tall fencing. And it shouldn't be any barbed wire. It should all be 2 straight wires, in my opinion, which I've learned from Rick here and Julie and Jim Coda, so that the cows can't get past it. They don't go near 2 wires. They're not going to jump over a fence, but the elk can easily get past it. Young and old, large and small.
Let's greet a couple more commenters because we're leaving some people out. And Sledge greeted DC. These guys are becoming regulars on here. Derek, you've mentioned a few times about the sensitivity of the elk, and Derek, God bless him, spends a lot of time out there quietly observing these animals and getting to know them. And I know it's extra heartbreaking for him when he finds one dying from the conditions that they live in. But shout out to you, Derek. Thanks for being here. Susan Kurtz, thank you for your comments. And Leah, Jack, she asks who else is not leaving, and she talks about Marin Sun Farms, who like 10 years ago, there was an editorial about them clearing $14 million in 1 year. Oh, poor people.
I believe it's Dave Evans owns Marin Sun Farms, the only remaining slaughterhouse in the area. He's up in Petaluma. So, Leah's coming at the thing we haven't talked about here is, oh, by the way, cattle ranching, it's a really cruel business. There were people in the town hall at Huffman saying, we love animals. Oh, we love animals. I'm like, wow. It's not that they saying something that they believe, but the disconnect, the cognitive dissonance is jaw-dropping. We love animals, and yet we confine them, forcibly impregnate them. Here's the symbol for forcible impregnation. Take their baby away, take all their milk, and kill them when they're young, but we love them. It's like the George Carlin routine about God. He loves you, but he needs money. Just can't handle money. So the other rancher is Neiman. I'm not sure if that's Bill Nyman. I think it's Bill Nyman. It's the Nyman Ranch at the southernmost seashore. That's the other ranch that's staying. I didn't finish that, so thank you. And I also want to thank Susan Kirks for showing up. She runs the wonderful Paula Lane Action Network Plan, who happens to be my fiscal sponsor for Tree Spirit Project donations. Full disclosure, she's a badger expert, and she says that elk and badgers will do well together. Badgers are on the grassland on the ranches now. Badgers and elk would be better without a lot of people. I know this, and sure, that's another issue here, but I'm looking forward to trying to navigate the waters of, there are a lot of new visitors in the park. We want to maintain some distance from the wildlife versus the far more destructive force of the cattle industry.
Well, and can I just bring up a point that I think as we go back to talking about the elk, think of the stress these elk have been under in this enclosure during the rut season. So you've got these dominant bulls, and I've been out in the rut season many times in different areas, and it's dynamic. I mean, I usually try and when I'm out doing 24-hour watches, I would be out where there'd be trees I could climb into if I had to, and I several times got chased into a tree. But this area is very small, and think of these. So what you saw along that fence line that was taken down is some of these bulls have been hoping for a while that they could get free, because they've been trapped in this small, 2,600 acres, whatever, small area during a rut season where those dynamic bulls, where those dominant bulls are incredible. And so now you're going to see this shift occur. So there'll be more normal behaviors occurring within the elk. They can shift out of an area. They're not going to try to harass people. They'll stay away. But again, people will have to be warned during the rut season. We have to look for this and that. There'll need to be discussions about trying to train the tourists about watching the elk from afar. You're not allowed to go close to them. There needs to be very strict dynamics about it, because the elk should not be blamed for what's going to happen when people do what they do in parks, which is often irresponsible. So this will be the next part that I think is really important, and hopefully we can work with the National Park Service to remind them and their team that these elk really are dynamic. They're going to be shifting, but watching how they stood next to that fence line, to me was really showing how in the fall that rut season had scared those bulls. And this is what's going to be wonderful to watch how they shift, what areas are going to shift into and help restore the landscape. All this is going to be amazing. And then again, monitoring the human population now. So the control should be put not on the elk, but on the humans. And that's a really important part. Now it's time for them to follow the rules in our national park that where wildlife is a major priority. And so we're going to have to try to work with the teams to make that a very clear statement.
Derek sent me some very powerful footage of the frustration of elk not being able to rut with each other at the fence line. And I filmed footage of when the water troughs were brought out, the reality that, well, that doesn't solve the problem for everyone because the bull isn't going to let the other males come near there with his elk there, which I thought was really interesting. But isn't it also interesting that now we have to somehow justify these free elk by letting people roam through these previous ranch lands where nobody complained that they weren't walking through cattle pasture? I mean, there's an interesting statistic about how cows kill more people than sharks. And yet we're only going to be alarmed about, and I don't think cows are violent. This is probably because of humans being really stupid. But now we have to worry about the elk getting in trouble because of human elk interactions. And we never had to, and no one was worried about any of that as long as it was a commodity animal. So Rick, you've been so quiet. Go ahead.
I wanted to get back to the economics.
Yes.
This is going to be a boon.
Yes.
To Marin County.
Yes.
In 2012, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service studied every state, and California got $3.8 billion in 2011 in wildlife viewing revenues, and $0.9 billion for hunting. So I'm not promoting hunting. I'm not anti. I'm just saying it was a huge amount of money for wildlife viewing. In Oregon's Jewel Meadows Wildlife Refuge, they had a problem. The elk were coming down into that valley to overwinter, and they were depredating the neighboring farms. So they brought in about $200,000 worth of alfalfa to keep the elk in the refuge and off the neighboring farms. They got $6.5 million in park admission fees. I'm not proposing we put hay bales out to draw elk. We don't need to. They're already there. But it just shows that there's a real economic value to the species. These are charismatic megafauna. This park's unique in the world.
I just want to identify Rick and our guests again, who are gracious to be here. That's Rick Landman, is an MD, runs the, correct me if I'm wrong, Rick, the Institute for Historical Ecology. You're a physician scientist and an ecologist, and you've also published, 130 published papers in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So you are really up on your subject here. Julie Phillips, we've met through the Point Reyes work and has been interviewed many times by Skyler, wildlife biologist who has spent over 30 years in the field specifically studying tule elk. One of the, if I may say, as they say on TV, preeminent experts about tule elk out in the field with them. So I'm really privileged to have you guys here. We're going to run long today, past our 10 o'clock hour, which is coming up now. And we'll have you back again, but we're going to do another show on Point Reyes next week. So I just want people to hang in there and know there's more of this to come because it's such an incredibly important topic right now.
Let me go back to what I said at the beginning of the show. Who wants to put money on whether or not Marin's economy collapses? We already have data that the tourism going into Point Reyes to view the wildlife sectors absolutely eclipses everything being put out by the dairies. Now you're going to add more of that natural attraction and pretend that there's going to be a problem? Stop it. And this is really why that's one of the reasons I'm sad about the cattle being there, because they're actually going to, in my opinion, prevent how fast we could get back to it looking beautiful and natural. We have more documentation from the FOIA documents of cattle chasing elk away from land than elk harassing cattle. So are those cattle not just going to hurt the land, but possibly disrupt the behavior of the elk every time that they're brought in? You're talking about trucking in 600 animals that weren't there and suddenly are there, which is what I see happen with the goats. People are like, oh, it's natural. You just brought in 600 animals and dropped them off in a confined area where wildlife are trying to live and think that that's not going to change things?
Yep, elk will shift in response to cattle. They definitely do. And so again, what is the mission of this national park? the elk should become the priority, as well as the badgers and other things that people are saying, which are so wonderful. Watching them coexist is incredible. And hopefully in the long run, the long term, maybe eventually wolves will be restored to parts of California. They already slowly, there's a few packs. So wouldn't it be incredible? I don't know if it's going to happen there, but the wolf is one of the primary predators of Thule elk and helping their genetic diversity and so on. So we've got a lot of issues at play. And again, this national park is going to be an incredible opportunity to study what's going to happen over the long run. Watch these elk move and shift. But people harass elk, dairy cattle harass the elk, cars harass, I mean, all these things make them shift. So watching what they do over the next few months, which you guys are doing so great, is going to be really important to see what happens.
So just the overview here at the top of the hour, we're talking about the dramatic historic settlement of two lawsuits, but specifically one lawsuit that was in just mediation alone for 2 years, with the Nature Conservancy coming up with millions of dollars to pay off ranchers, and a lot of them will be leaving the park. My overview, my take on this, if you were looking for this settlement to solve the problem and end ranching in the park and end grazing in the park and make it completely wild the way it should be and was always supposed to be from the founders, this is a crushing disappointment. It does not do that. So that's Skyler's take on it, and he's 100% right. I choose to see it as a huge step in the right direction. Reduction of cattle, and now for the first time, ask Julie, and I want to ask Julie, when you went out and saw that a big hole in the fence, part of the fence is removed, about an eighth of the 2-mile fence of the Thule Elk Reserve, which is one of the 3 herds in the park, has been cut open, and now in effect the herds are all reunited and free for the first time. It's a huge step in the right direction. Is that not correct?
Yes, it's incredible. It was, I just didn't, my Thule elk guide, I have the 3 captive herds. Now there's 2. So this is one of the captive herds I have. I have, different categories, captive fenced herds and so on. So now we still have Tutman State Elk Reserve in Kern County that's captive, fenced, and San Luis Island in Merced County. But the Point Reyes National Seashore, I crossed it off. So one of the 3 captive herds has now been removed. So that's a step. That's a really big step.
Well, let me take Skyler's position, if I may. Skyler, tell me if I've gone far enough here, but you shouldn't take it off the list. It's still a fenced, controlled herd of elk at Point Reyes because they can't wander anywhere. They're not allowed still. They can go wander anywhere on 71,000 acres of seashore, which is a tremendous increase. They can't wander into the other 10,000 acres, 9,000 acres of GGNRA contiguous on the other side of Highway 1, which is kind of one of the borders-ish.
And we still have the very significant concern that Julie has pointed out that the free elk, not in Tamales Point, reproduced at a slower rate than the ones in Tamales Point, which doesn't make sense unless somebody's killing them. Well, we can't say that for sure, but it's a big concern.
But those ranches, but my understanding is sorry, Julie, but the ranches, what is it? You know those down there better than I do. Is it A, B, and C ranch down there? Those guys are selling out. They're going to be clearing off the land. They haven't yet. That's part of the deal. They've signed to say they're going to leave in 15 months.
Which one is Home Ranch?
I'm sorry?
What keeps them out of GGNRA? What keeps them from going further south?
Good question.
Yeah. By the way, the ranches are staying in GGRNA.
Correct.
Yeah. So, but already the elk at limit, the 2 quote unquote free herds on Point Reyes, they can jump an 8-foot fence. I mean, they're jumping these fences, hanging with the cattle, getting chased off, returning. The ranchers are complaining about them competing for forage. We're complaining that the cattle are competing with the elk for forage. But I dream of, so I study historical ecology. I study what California used to look like and all of its rich biodiversity, which is incredible. Richard Henry Dana, when he was at anchor in the Golden Gate in December, I want to say 1835, he wrote about hundreds and hundreds of elk at the Golden Gate on the beautiful sloping hill. So these elk are going to continue to expand their population, and those bulls that are pushed out by the alpha bull are going to start moving.
Correct.
And we need to think and plan about, but I dream of the day they make it to the Marin Headlands where people will get to see them from the bridge.
Which of you 2 elk experts or together would like to organize and fundraise for some sort of Thule elk study, which would serve so many purposes, bring more public interest, bring more media attention, be good for the elk, bring more students and young people into this issue, because we're going to need another generation of people to fight this, to advocate for the wild, 10 years from now, when the elk population gets big enough that, okay, we need to consider, can we move some of the suburb out to other areas of California? It's a great problem to have, a quote unquote overpopulation of elk, which for me, again, is an oxymoron. There's no such thing as too many elk at this point. There's too few elk still.
It's a great question to throw out there. Let's let them prepare their answer for next week. Because I want to shout out to Sledge, who asked about when will the native grasses reseed? What season does that happen, or who's going to bring in the seed? And I have an answer to that. As you can imagine, it's not a good one. Shout out to Jeff Phillips, who said hello to all of us, and just a quick acknowledgement of Jeremy mentioning what most people feel when they go to Point Reyes is the impression that you can't walk through the ranch land, which is conveniently exactly how the ranchers wanted you to feel, even though you could have done so. The Point Reyes National Seashore on their website, and the last time that page was updated was 2007, bragged about doing a native grassland reseeding program. And I called, using a different name, of course, to find out about it. It didn't exist, and it never happened. And what I've heard from other ecologists is it's really hard to get true native seeds. Most of it's governmentally controlled, and it's extremely expensive. So that's where I'd like to see some money being spent to bring in the seeds that might not be able to come back on their own, instead of spending that money on cattle contracts.
Yeah, and I want to throw out this concept. You brought up research. I think it'd really be cool for a university to take this on PhD research. I won't be directly, I would assist if I could, but really I think the universities need to really look at this as a possibility. But I want to go back to one thing that I think is central to this, is the Thule elk needs some special designation within the state of California. I keep bringing this up because, to me, I tried to get them nominated as our state mammal, and I was told that's a joke. Cal Berkeley will be mad. I said, well, how about our state, ungulate, vertebrate, so on? They need some special designation because the overall management of them occurs through the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, the state agency. And in this particular case, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has deferred to Point Reyes National Seashore, to the National Park Service. So they don't manage any of that. But what's happening statewide within the Thule elk range, within the existing herds that are left, is that the California Department of Fish and Wildlife says that they're a money maker for the state of California. And that means they're hunted in many places. And so what's really becoming a serious issue as climate change is accelerating is, will these elk survive over time? And because of the incredible loss of diversity, genetic diversity within these few populations that many are not connected, including Point Reyes National Seashore, that should become a priority within this National Park Service to become the model for allowing these elk to roam freely without being harassed. I know the area doesn't seem that large, but I don't think that's a worry at this point, because again, I think their movements are going to be slow. Some will leave the area they're in, some will not. It'll just take time to watch what's going on. But we need to make this a model that the elk were saved in this area by a change in policy. And there needs to be more pressure within the state of California by our citizens to get some special designation, because we're the only state that has our own subspecies of North American elk, the Thule elk. It is so amazing. And yet we have the California Department of Fish and Wildlife that, again, refuses to acknowledge this. And they're the ones that kind of let Point Reyes do what they did. Mm-hmm. Whereas if you went out and did that and you were caught somewhere in California, you get prosecuted for it. You went out and shot an elk illegally, supposedly. So again, I think this is an opportunity to put pressure, all of us that are part of this, continue to put pressure. And I've met with Congress people at the federal level. I've met with state people. I tried to get the governor. I've tried all these things, and it's really difficult. But the more this becomes public, from what you're seeing happening at Point Reyes, giving better status, more improved status to Thule elk as kind of our state vertebrate or ungulate or some special designation, it should be protected. And again, the genetic health is the primary concern. And so Point Reyes becomes the starting point for this bigger discussion.
To do that,
think about Jack's quote. Think about Jack's quote from earlier about the people at that rally who called themselves animal lovers. It went over their heads that wildlife should be included in that category, animals. And they were referring to themselves as animal lovers because they wanted cattle to stay. It just really concerns me that we want to, what you want, Julie, is commendable, but think about these good people and they're like, wait, they didn't even think about the well-being of the livestock. I mean, the wildlife, because they're not commodities.
I see your observation, and to Leah Wilborn, I see on here's delight. I will raise you tenfold. For 50 years, I would call myself an animal lover and a cow lover. And I love pigs and I love chickens and I love all animals. And I ate them all. And it's called cognitive dissonance. We're all capable of it. It's actually, that is the norm. It is the freaks who go on to realize, oh, wait, if I love an animal, how is that animal being prepared for me to eat? And it's brutal. And then you become one of those people from the fifth brightest star in the sky, Vega. You travel off the planet Earth and normal, and you become a vegan. I want to give a shout out to Stephen Axelrod. I can't believe he's here. He wins the record for traveling the longest distance to listen to our web-based podcast here. He's in Bern, Switzerland, land of dairy, milk, and cuckoo clocks, as we joke here in America. He is from Brooklyn. He and I used to sit in the mid-1980s at our desk jobs as copywriters in New York City at J. Walter Thompson, the ad agency. And we have actually kept touch thanks to Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. And Steven's here listening. So I'm thrilled to have you, Steve. We should bring you on and we should just do some of our comic riffs from back then. Leah Wilborn adds, and animal farming is a top driver, if not the #1 driver of climate change and environmental destruction everywhere, not just in Point Reyes. And I will, whenever Leah reminds me, mention on every friggin' show on any topic I'm on, because it's the big cow in the room of the climate crisis, ocean acidification, ocean dead zones, water contamination, ozone depletion, global warming with greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, on and on and on, from eating beef and drinking and eating dairy products. If you're listening, folks, and you have the courage to follow through and you really do love animals, go vegan. Stop eating these products. There's wonderful replacements.
And we didn't have to go. We didn't even have to go the vegan route. Which, how about just the mindset that humans can't find value in nature?
Two separate but overlapping issues. But sure, yeah, you don't have to go vegan. But I'm taking a play from Miyoko's playbook, which is not being afraid of the word, because it's like, oh, I don't want to hear that word. Like, why? But because you're trained to not hear it versus, normalize it. It's no big deal. It means you don't eat animals because you love them.
Guys, I have another live that I have to go to, but I want our special guest to get the last word in, and maybe everyone would like to come back next week because clearly there's much more to talk about. Julie, what's burning in your mind that we didn't talk about that we need to cover next week? Next time.
Let's develop and start lobbying for some special designation for our Thule elk, because to me, we are not guaranteed we're going to have Thule elk in our lifetime. Definitely mine, but beyond that, we want to see our grandchildren have Thule elk here in California. So again, they need some special protection. We need to raise the education about them. Whenever I go out and speak to people about them, the young people just rise up. They love this topic. And they're really intrigued by it. And when I taught a Thule elk class at De Anza College, when I was teaching there for many years, the students loved it. And they said, nobody's ever told us about these elk. We didn't even know we had elk. So we need to get a special designation. We need to have a huge lobbying group. Obviously, the dairy people have their lobbying group. I respect that. That's their deal. But now we need to rise up, because we are not guaranteed we'll have Thule elk at the current rate, because many of these herds are not connected. Their genetic diversity is in trouble, as I mentioned. And this is a moment with climate change that we have to really raise the status of this particular subspecies of elk.
Paula agrees with you in the chat, and I agree with you. And I put it to you, Julie, if you can come up with something, maybe it's state undulate, maybe you just hit it there, but think about it, formulate it a little bit more. I can bring it to the wonderful In Defense of Animals, who I do work for, and they would be a good person, a good organization to put it out to the general public. I assume it's a matter of raising public awareness and then going to the government and banging on them, right?
Yep.
Okay, so that's all possible. It might be a great campaign ongoing featuring Point Reyes, but then, of course, Thule elk throughout the state.
Well, I just want to mention that I want them to be our state mammal because the grizzly bear is our state mammal. It's extinct. And then when I went to the elected officials, I said, well, Julie, that'll make, UC Cal Berkeley really mad. And I said, well, that's great. And I appreciate that. But the bottom line is we've got an extinct state mammal. That's ridiculous. So how about making it our state vertebrate?
Yeah, if you're worried about upsetting UC Berkeley, maybe UC Berkeley could take on the responsibility of getting the grizzly bear back in the state. Rick.
So I think what Julie's saying is really important. Although we have 6,000 Thule elk back statewide, they're on these biogeographic islands that aren't connected. A wildfire, disease, hunting, poaching could knock out any one of these populations. So I think we need to rebrand Point Reyes as the only park in the world with breeding hoofed megafauna and breeding marine megafauna. There is nothing like it. And there are pieces missing. Sea otter are missing. They should be in Tomales Bay. They provide vast ecosystem services in terms of returning our kelp beds. Pronghorn are missing. There are archaeological remains of pronghorn in Marin. Of course, for them to survive at Point Reyes, all that fencing has to be changed to wildlife-friendly fencing, as Jack said. And beaver are missing, right? One of my papers a few years ago proved that they were native to our coastal watersheds. Alima Creek would probably be where I would start. They also beaver ponds help mitigate wildfires. So those are just three. I know wolves are controversial, but if we could focus on continue to make this incredible, unique place even greater. I don't know how it got branded as this place you go to see historic ranches. You can go
I know how it happened.
Yeah, I mean, you can go see there's historic ranches. You can go, there's 1,000 places to see historic ranch, but there's only one Point Reyes. There's nothing like it in the world.
Beautiful, Rick. Thank you for being here, man. We got to go. You got to get you out of here, right, Skyler?
We do, and what a great discussion, but leave them wanting more. I hope everyone can come back next Tuesday. And I do have, if you want to know how this happened, it's actually in the full film Elkwater, which I just put the link up to. Anyways, thank you so much, Rick and Julie, and thank you for all the kind people supporting us in the chat. We have some new people, Light Occult Revival. Hello and welcome. And Jeremy was new today. Thank you. And Stephen Axelrod, thank you for coming.
He's in Switzerland. He's from Brooklyn. We were in advertising together. He was my mentor. He's a couple of years older, and he would teach me about all the movies I didn't see, like Shane. Like, what's Shane? He's a great guy. Skyler, I just want to give you the final plug. For me, it's treespiritproject.com. And I have treespiritproject.com/elk is my elk page. And in the next 36 hours, I'm going to put up a very, very, very long blog about all this stuff. And we'll be back next week with more. Skyler, where can people find you?
Here on this YouTube channel. It's where I put most of my updates. You can also go to shameofpointreyes.org, but I don't update it as often as I should because I'm always busy editing. You could also go over to the ecology channel. I'm trying to get George Werthner on to talk about how all the unnatural fire breaks in LA, the 10-lane freeways and all the concrete still wasn't enough of a defensive space to stop fire. The idea that fuel is our enemy versus conditions is the topic that we'll be discussing.
And can I just say that you can look at my website at naturebasedteaching.com. And my Thule elk guide is up there for free, so you could download the PDF if you'd like.
It's a great guide.
At naturebasedteaching.com, and it has a whole history of the Thule elk. There's a whole page on it, so that'll give you more information.
Thule elk biologist can be found at naturebasedteaching.com or org. Did you say?
.com.
Naturebasedteaching.com. Rick, you don't have a website, right? We need a web programmer to come forward and get you a website and put up all your papers, right?
Alas, you have to use Google Scholar to look up the 4 elk publications we have.
Wow. Okay. Well, so this goes along with making it a state undulate. We actually have a page where people go and they can get resources to you two guys.
The Park Service needs to build you two a facility out there and an ongoing classroom so that you can show people as it happens, restoration ecology.
And restart the elk docent program again.
I'll
That Laura
be your
Sheridan
first student.
That'd be great.
Mm.
Thank you
Thanks,
so much.
thanks everybody.
Thank you.